A lot of the internet these days feels pretty bought and paid for, don't you think? Well, at Escape Collective, we are also bought and paid for. The difference being that we are bought and paid for by you, which changes things dramatically. We're a member-funded group of journalists, and we call the shots. No hidden agendas, no sneaky links. Just trust. EscapeCollective.com/join. Support what we do.
Welcome back to Geek Warning, the show that brings everything worth knowing about bicycle tech into a single place. I'm your host, Dave Rome, and this week we have a full cast, including Escape Collective tech editor, Ronan Mc Laughlin. Ronan, hello.
Hiya.
Good to hear your voice. We probably won't hear from you a lot in the next few weeks, and certainly didn't hear from you last week just because your time zone is a little on the opposite side of us. So I think it's 11 o'clock there tonight at the moment.
You might not even hear from me all that much in this show because, at least in terms of the three people on this call, I am definitely the most NDA'd person on the call. So I'm here to talk about a lot of stuff that I really can't talk about. But sure, let's do it. Let's do it anyway.
Fair enough. Okay, so I think just given the time zone, we'll only hear from you briefly, but yeah, we'll get to that. And also joining me today is Wrench to the Stars, Brad Copeland. Hello, Brad.
Hello. Thanks for having me back.
It's the first time I met Brad, like not in person, but virtually at least. And have you ever like seen a picture of a DJ and the voice didn't match the image? I'm really getting that sense.
Well, not. I also don't recognize my own voice when I hear it back on recording. So
I don't know. I didn't really have. I hadn't envisioned what you might look like, and then I met you, and it was like, yeah, okay, yeah. Oh,
Ronan, you just told me you never watched a single World Cup cross country round on Red Bull TV.
I mean, did I have to tell you that, or did you already know?
I kind of already knew it. I already knew it. Brad, last week I put you on the spot by asking you your most prized bicycle in your collection. You answered it was that a Cervelo R5 California, which is a pretty incredibly cool rim brake bike. But I was hoping you'd pick a 26-inch wheeled mountain bike. So if you had to pick one with the smaller, wider wheels, what is it?
I would have to choose between two. One's a 1986 Fisher Pro Caliber. It's like the predecessor to Gary Fisher, the brand, when he was making them sort of by himself in small batches in California. It's also my birth year. That'd be one. And the other I have is an all-stop beam breezer. So it's like a soft ride flex beam breezer steel frame mountain bike, which is pretty unusual. It has a 4-inch travel soft ride stem on it too. So if you like your handlebars to be all over the place and in an unusual position at all times, it's a great bike, but it's super.
That is a quirky bike,
weird bike from I think it's a 94, so it's a 95 maybe, I'm not sure, but all
right,
it's a weirdo one. Yep.
Interesting. I think we'll bring up those bikes again in the future because I'd like to know how a soft ride compares to a modern bike that you have in your quiver, which it might be a short conversation, not well is my guess.
Yeah, but we've come a long way.
Indeed. I guess speaking of coming a long way, there seems to have been quite a lot of tech development in the last week. So we've had the world's biggest gravel event, Unbound, which has teased a whole bunch of new tech. We've also had Dauphiné, which is sort of a chance for what, it sort of acts as a showcase of what's to come for the tour. And Ronan, you have seen quite a few new bikes there, and as a result, you've actually kept a lot of tech editors with competing websites busy all weekend because of what you shared in your Performance Process newsletter. So I think we'll cover some of those. And then, I guess later in the episode, we'll get to some creative ways to undo cranks. Before we kick off chatting about all this, I'll quickly say that we don't have any advertising or hidden agenda on this podcast, rather exists solely due to the support from Escape Collective members and subscribers. We have member-only podcasts for those that support our content, so please support the content you enjoy and consume. Head to escapecollective.com/member. Okay, Ronan, it's almost midnight for you. Let's chat about the swarm of new bikes that you saw at Dauphiné. Yeah. What are some highlights?
Well, that performance process newsletter that you mentioned there actually came out before Dauphiné. And those,
did it?
Yeah, those bikes had surfaced before the race even kicked off. I think the new Canyon Air Road may be a good place to start, because I actually spotted that on the previous Saturday watching the Monaco Grand Prix. Or not actually watching the Monaco Grand Prix, but watching Ted's qualifying notebook on Sky Sports F1. And Ted Kravitz, the pit reporter for Sky Sports, happened to be walking through the pits, and one of the Valtteri Bottas team staff members was coming through with what they referred to as a limited edition Northern Lights inspired painted Canyon Air Road. But I mean, it was immediately obvious from the handlebars that this was not a current air road, and then in closer inspection it was looked like an entirely new frame. I have to admit that I, at that point, because I was sort of swamped, sat on that piece for a bit, thinking I'll put that in the newsletter on Friday, thinking that nobody else would have spotted that on Sky Sports F1. Turns out that everybody else spotted it on Sky Sports F1, or at least enough people spotted and tweeted enough tech writers that every other website then beat us to the punch on that one. But that was, you could have easily missed that was a new Canyon Air Road, because it is so like the existing Air Road.
That's probably a common theme from the bikes that you have covered, is most of them look a whole lot like the bike that currently exists, and it's hard to see that they're new.
So there's the Air Road, and there's also a few days after that, photos emerged of Ineos Grenadiers on a training camp spin with what I was going to say what appears to be, it obviously is a new Pinarello Dogma, and then, thanks to our colleagues who are actually on the ground at Dauphiné from other publications who have got photos up close to that bike, it definitely is a Pinarello Dogma. It still says F on it. I think that has now finally confirmed for us what the F actually stands for, and that it's facelift, because there's not much else going on with that bike other than, as I described it in the newsletter, and anybody who hasn't checked out that newsletter yet, be sure to sign up. It'll come directly to your inbox. It's free. You can access the entire newsletter. It'll have loads of tech tidbits like this, all our quick reviews, sort of like a one-stop shop for quick news hit from the past 2 weeks. But it'll also include the latest episode of Performance Process podcast. And
you can sign up now from our homepage. There's a little sign up section there, and you can sign up to Threaded as well if you want my newsletter about tools. So there you go.
I might also just say,
shameless plugs for the day.
I might also just say, even if you've signed up previously, do so again, because there was a bit of a tech glitch where if you signed up to a new newsletter, it unsubscribed you from another one that you had already subscribed to. So if you want Threaded, and you want Performance Process, and you want Wheel Talk, and you want Spin Cycle, make sure you're signed up to them. They are
individual lists.
Yeah.
So you get just the one you signed up for, nothing more. And by the sounds of it, sometimes you get something less. So
what I was going to say there was, as I referred to it in that newsletter, the new Dogma looks like someone has let Dan Bigham loose with a tub of polyfiller on the existing Dogma, and that they've just made the head tube deeper and the bottom bracket sort of deeper also. From what we can see, I mean, the kind of train of thought with these bikes at the moment is that they look the same. They're presumably very close in terms of aerodynamics. What else could they have done? They could have done two things. They could have fixed existing issues and like the Air Road didn't have the smoothest version last time around. There was problems with handlebars, problems with seat posts. But they Canyon had already sort of addressed those. The Dogma wasn't the most successful Dogma ever. I reviewed it. It wasn't the best Dogma I'd ever ridden, and so
you had some flexible seat tube issues on yours, and
which Pinarello
some
denied.
Questionable symmetry.
Yeah, Pinarello did say I was wrong. Others have corroborated my opinions. So make of that what you will. But the only other thing they could have done with these frames is make them lighter. So that's kind of wait and see with those ones. But it is sort of a trend in that, and I don't know if it's because we're like we've hit peak aero and bike brands can't really go any further, and they're sort of combined into the avenues they've taken, and all they can do is like marginally optimize with new iterations of the frames they've already got, and that's why these not so new looking new bikes don't look all that new. They're just like marginal updates, so to speak. But the other trend that is very much has been alive and kicking for the last 5 years or so at this point is the one bike to rule them all approach, and bikes amalgamating their aero and their climbing bike into one. And it seems like that's what Trek have gone ahead and done with the Amonda and the Madone.
Following suit from like the Tarmac, and I mean there's other examples out there, but I don't think it'll be the last example either. Like I think I think you pointed out to me that Scott has a new Addict on the UCI approved list.
Yes.
And based on rumors I'd heard, I mean, who knows, maybe we'll see the foil go away, but that's wild speculation at this point.
And I think that's whatever about the Scott, we literally haven't even seen a bike there, so we know absolutely nothing about what's happening there. But in terms of the Trek especially, I'm pretty disappointed about what seems like it's about to happen, and that I just believe that the one bike solution it's not optimizing either terrain, and it's compromising both.
I mean, Brad, you're in a shop at the moment. You'd probably have an opinion on this, which is my skeptical view of this is that it's better for business to have the one bike to rule it all. What's your take? I mean, you're not really on the retail front, you're in the workshop, but what's your take on that?
I kind of lean towards Ronan's perspective on this, just in my own enjoyment of road cycling. I kind of fancy myself as a road enthusiast, sort of deep down, despite what my professional accolades and so forth might suggest. And so I've always liked having a bike that's very specific to the application. I think very light bikes are enjoyable and wonderful to ride, and I feel like it's hard to get, I mean, in combination with the tech that has come about in the last 5 or 6 years and become commonplace, like disc brakes and power meters everywhere and all this stuff, I kind of find myself yearning for the days of a simpler time, in some regards, and then also having those aero bikes for the really, to take it to the limit and the kind of other end of the spectrum, where you go in the same way that sort of triathlon bikes have lately, kind of just despite how convoluted and obnoxious they are kind of to live with, the end result is unbelievable when it's done correctly. And so I always like that approach, having a really aero bike and a really kind of specific bike for climbing. And so that would be my preference. I think it's probably easier though for shops and for manufacturers to have only one bike, especially with all these proprietary parts and integrated stuff, to have fewer of those small parts to try to manage inventory of, which I know in the past has been a big hiccup. When little things like that get delayed in production, they can throw off the whole model year for months or even a year at a time. So I could see it from both sides, but my personal preference is to have a bike that's very specific to the application.
Yeah, interesting. I think you just earned a lot of points with Ronan on that.
big time.
Big
great.
Thumbs up.
I was going to just ask us though, how do we feel about not so new looking new bikes? I don't know if I'm going to be like a hypocrite or what, but like both the Air Road and the Dogma are very similar looking to the existing bikes, and one I'm okay with and one I'm not. And I'll explain my position. You can tell me if I'm bonkers or what, but the Air Road has been about for 4 years, which in terms of model cycles is, let's just say it's probably the minimum that's acceptable, but it's on the outer edge of what's the norm at this point. I think 5 would be better. 6 years would be a dream, but that's just not going to happen. So it's been around for a while. It's had its issues, so presumably an update to those wouldn't be a bad thing. And then it's been the most successful bike this year, so it's kind of like, well, I know the rider is much more important than the bike, but in terms of Spring Classics, it was the bike on top step of the podium most often, and it kind of feels like don't mess with a winning formula, so to speak. Or I don't even believe that as I'm saying it, but I can at least accept that might be the position the brand would take. Whereas for the Dogma, in my opinion, it wasn't the best Dogma ever. It hasn't been all that successful in EOS, and it's only 3 years old. and so like it being just a minor iteration, I can't see it suddenly becoming the best Dogma ever with what they've done. And so I'm sort of interested to try that bike to see if they've done, and hear more about that bike to see what is underneath the skin that we can't see in the photos we have seen.
I'm personally fine with iterative improvements where like it's not super obvious, it's not super blatant, as long as the brand isn't overly ambitious with their marketing about it. Like, I think a Pinarello will come out and be like, new Pinarello, lighter, stiffer, faster. It's the best Dogma we've ever created.
But it can't be lighter because they have their, is it 750 or 850 gram frame limit where they won't go beneath that. And the Dogma F was at that.
Okay.
So it can't be lighter.
Okay. Interesting. But yeah, I think it's a marketing issue for me where the brands overhype these bikes that are very similar to before. It's like, awesome. Like, even if you made little iterative updates every year to these bikes and didn't change the price, like, that would be great. I'd be happy with that. But just don't try tell your entire customer base that they now need to upgrade. So yeah, I think that's the sticking point for me. It's not, I'm happy that brands are making small changes to these bikes that are already really, really good in most cases, and you can only make small changes. Like, you're not going to save 20% of the weight out of these bikes now. Like, there's not that much there's not that much material you can remove from these things anymore. So I don't know. I'm fine with it. I just wish brands would take a bit more of a humble approach to it.
One thing I haven't seen noticed just on the weight topic one thing I haven't seen mentioned, and it could well have been, I just haven't been reading, is there does also seem to be a new bar stem on the Dogma. And, I think areas like that are where you can find weight savings now. Yeah, forks.
For sure.
Integrated handlebars. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to find wheel savings because that's not the bike manufacturer. You're not going to find savings in the group sets. The frames are sort of, I think if you want to make the frame much lighter, you either have to sacrifice stiffness or increase fragility quite a bit. And so that's not really anything either. Neither of those are things that we really want. So yeah, perhaps there's opportunities in terms of optimizing those components around the frame. But yeah, time will tell. I had another point, but it's late at night and it's escaped my mind.
No, I mean, to your point, like, I think that's, the frames have gotten pretty dialed, and there haven't been huge shifts in the manufacturing technology in recent years, like in the last just 3 years, I'll say. But with forks and handlebars, it feels like there is still progress being made there in how they're making forks and how they're able to make handlebars. Like, forks by a lot of brands up until recently were made in multiple pieces, where like the steerer tube was bonded into the crown with the legs then bonded on and molded together, whereas there are now manufacturers doing proper one-piece forks where everything is molded at one point and you can remove a lot of overlapping material that way. So there are gains to be had there as long as the brands are willing to make the investment in the required tooling. So I think that's where we're seeing things going at this point in time, and where the gains still lay.
I think the real winners here are the people who have the existing models of these bikes, because
sure,
would you upgrade to either of these new bikes? Seeing what we're seeing at the moment, you could turn up to the group ride on Saturday morning, and nobody would know if you're on. Nobody would notice if you're on. Like, if you compare that to if you had the Dogma F12 and the Dogma F came out, it was visually very different. If you turned up in the Dogma F now, it's not going to be outdated or as noticeably outdated.
Yeah, I mean, that's the benefit to it, right? From a consumer point of view, it's so similar that they don't feel a need, they don't feel a push to have to upgrade. And I feel like similar thing happened with group sets recently. New SRAM Red is not that different to old SRAM Red. It's all in the shifters, and even Durace 12 speed didn't offer a significant reason to upgrade if you're on 11 speed. And so I think, we are at a point where the progress in road, I specify road, is relatively slow, that I think, there's not a lot of forces pushing people to get something new. It's really it's probably a consumer desire rather than a need.
There's probably listeners screaming at the I was going to say their radios. You don't listen to podcasts on your radio, but screaming back at us right now. What about the giant TCR? And I feel very much the same about that. Like, it was very much iterative. The biggest visually difference was integrating the brake hoses.
Sure.
But speaking to giant dealers, that's what people were walking into the shop and asking for. So it's like, arguably, that's a small update that is a bigger difference. And the S5 before that, again, it was very, very difficult to spot the difference. I actually wrote an article about the new S5, and people told me that I was hallucinating, not in so many words, but that I was looking at the existing S5 and there was no new one, but there actually was. And the difference there was inside the head tube in terms of the bumper stop and making the front end much more manageable. And so minor updates like that to what are already good frames, I think, are a good approach.
Yeah, all for it. Ronan, any other new bikes before we worth chatting about before we let you sleep?
There was also the new Dare used by Uno X, but I'd covered that at Tour of Flanders. So very, very aero looking bike. So there's a full. It's one of the Tour of Flanders tech galleries that we went into that in more detail. There's also the new Willier, and that's a brand who seemingly are not going to amalgamate their aero and climbing bike, because this is looking at it that it's just a pure climbing bike. So it's done with a prototype paint job and all that. We don't know. I was going to say we don't know. We can't say much about that bike at the moment.
Okay.
Because
you can't say I don't know.
Yeah, I could say because I've written that it's in my garage. It's I know plenty about it, but and the last thing I'll just say is that I had my first ride on SRAM, the new SRAM Red today. And I have my hands have a new love in their life. Those new levers.
That's cool to hear.
Yes.
It's definitely. Yeah, I mean, as we've covered before, the new SRAM Red, it's definitely all about the shifters, and they've done well in that regard. So, and those shifters, I think, before we say goodbye, will actually lead us into an important chat of things seen at Unbound, actually, because they're being used in something else new from SRAM. But Ronan, thank you for jumping on and staying awake a bit longer. It's good to hear from you.
Mm-hmm. Good to hear and see you.
Before I let you go, what's the next performance process podcast people should expect?
Next performance process has actually an interesting guest. And I want to first of all just mention our previous performance process came out last Friday, was with Sadie Fitton. Sadie has stage 4 metastatic breast cancer diagnosis. Got that diagnosis on the other side of the planet on a holiday in Italy from an Italian translator, about 6 weeks after she'd attempted the elevation gain 24-hour world record. And obviously that was huge news, but it didn't stop her from making a second attempt at the world record. And so in the podcast last Friday, we delved into all the sort of the incredible preparation work that she'd done for trying to attempt that 24-hour elevation gain world record, right down to surveying the climb, very special climbing bike, training, nutrition, lab testing. Everything was a very interesting episode, but also very importantly, she took us through what it's like having cancer, and stage 4 to explain what that means is it's treatable, but it's not curable. So that was I don't know how to describe that conversation, but it's very, very
a moving conversation.
I'll maybe just say it again while can edit out. That was a moving conversation and well worth tuning into. Next week is with believe it or not, with Stefan Kung on the future of time traveling, and that was a very, very interesting conversation also. So look forward to publishing that. Yeah.
All right. Well, on that,
there'll be another Geek Warning before that, so it feels like really
there will be
preempting it, but that's what's coming next.
All right. Thank you, Ronan. Have a good night. It's time to talk some off-road stuff, but before we do, I owe the audience a corrections corner, because last week we discussed the wheels of the Ineos Grenadiers mountain bike team, Pauline Ferrand-Pivot and Tom Pidcock, that they both won on in, was it Nova Mesto? I think so.
It was, yeah.
And I had a text message from someone close to the team who had said that they were Pi wheels, and upon reading that closer, it was actually, they had said it was P1 wheels, which I knew, and I had mistaken that for being Pi rope spokes, which are another textile spoke. But we have had confirmation that the blatantly white spokes they're racing on were actually Bird spokes out of the US. So, sorry, Bird. With that out of the way, Unbound. So there's a few things going on here. There's Unbound is kind of the unofficial world championships for gravel, and it has kind of started to become like the Sea Otter Classic or the Eurobike for the gravel world, where it's sort of a chance for all the brands to reveal what they're working on and what might be coming out, whether it's ready or not. And there's a pretty long list of things here, and I guess, I don't know where to start with this. Should we start, given that Ronan just mentioned the red shifters? Should we start with where we've seen those new red shifters? So it seems like those new red shifters are gonna be compatible with 13 speed derailleurs, because there's new Explore out and about, which has an extra gear, but there's more to it than that. Brad, what did you see?
It was the same. It almost reminded me a little bit of. Do you remember when SRAM released the 11-speed mechanical? I'm sorry, it was 10-speed mechanical, but it was like the second generation of it before 11-speed mechanical came out. It lasted like 6 months, and it looked exactly like the 11-speed version, but it was only 10-speed, and it was sort of like this mid-phase kind of production that sort of got lost, and I think probably confused a lot of people because of how similar things looked. It kind of reminds me of that. I would speculate too that so it looks like it was a UDH based group, if I'm not mistaken, similar to the mountain bike transmission group. Is that also what you saw, Dave? That's what I believe I was looking at.
Yeah, exactly. So, UDH, so like T-type derailleur that needs a universal derailleur hanger interface. Basically, it looks like almost like a replica of mountain bike transmission groups. Right. But, I think an easy speculation would be that we'll probably see road groups to follow. That this current new SRAM Red that we're very excited about, especially about the ergonomics of the hoods themselves and some of the features that are built into them. I would expect that to be probably a sooner than later something we see. I guess gravel's kind of the hot segment in the market, so maybe they get first dibs this time around. But I'd see a road group to follow for sure.
Probably an expand.
So what we did see, like we saw quite a few of the pros. I think Pace McAlvin was on it. I think Keegan Swenson was on it. There was a few others that were on this new Explore group set, and basically it did look exactly like the new red shifter and brakes, existing crank matched with this new 13-speed cassette and derailleur that look very much like current mountain bike transmission stuff. And I guess, the unknowns are like, we don't know the gear ratios. The photos I saw did show what looked like really tight spaced gearing sort of towards the higher end of the cassette, which is quite exciting. So not big jumps there. But it did look like the cassette was also smaller than the existing 52 tooth setup that you get on mountain bikes. So I do expect that to be a lot tighter in spacing. But it does look to borrow a lot of tech and a lot of concepts. And obviously the big thing here, the big hold up here for a lot of people with current gravel bikes that may be wanting this stuff is you need a UDH hanger to handle this stuff. And not many gravel bikes currently in the market have that. Which I guess leads me on to some of the bikes that we saw running this, which aren't out yet, including a new Trek Checkpoint. There was a new Specialized Crux, which kind of looked exactly like the existing Crux, but potentially with new dropouts. There are many, many other bikes, but I mean, those two are certainly the big talking points from Unbound.
Yeah, I'd love to actually get some information about this stuff, but we often requested on the mountain bike side of things a slightly tighter ratio than the 1050 or 1052 options that SRAM offers on the mountain bike side, or at least they used to offer the 1050. we wanted something like a 1048 or a 1046 for a lot of the courses to keep those steps, like you say, smaller. And I have a feeling that especially, with the speeds being what they are in gravel and how it sort of leans more toward road in some aspects, at least, you kind of want those jumps between gears to be a little bit tighter, so you're not spun out or
for the pack racing style of gravel.
Yes, and I could see that being something from the high performance gravel side of the market where they really, when I'm sure they were asking for feedback from athletes, especially the fast ones like you just mentioned. I imagine that was right at the top of the list. So I would also be curious to see if we see any of these parts used in mountain bike racing in the future too, if the standards work the way that it looks like they might, which could potentially be interesting as well.
Definitely some big question marks over there given the extra cog. But I mean, it's worth noting that Shimano does have a 10 to 45 tooth cassette, which has been popular amongst like professional cross-country racers. So I mean, there is a precedent there. And I guess, in the gravel side, you can also use that cassette with GRX. So SRAM, current SRAM Explorer is 10 to 44 tooth. And I personally have been a bit vocal about that not being enough range for proper like explore style gravel riding, not to be too cheeky.
I think that's
with the
why
name,
everyone runs the mullet, in my experience, people kind of don't go for the Explorer group.
No, they use the mountain bike setup. So so for me, like that's kind of a sticking point. So I expect them to add more range or the option of more range, but we'll see. So other new things, also from SRAM, it kind of looks like Zip might have some new wheels that are wider than before. This is something that Alex Howes said a no comment to in a special episode of the Geek Warning podcast last week in relation to his tire setup for Unbound. That was a great chat if you haven't listened to it. But it seems that the current width of 25 mil is going to grow from the photos we've seen. They definitely look wider than existing rims. So, I would say too, coming from Zip as sort of some of the pioneers of aerodynamics that we kind of all associate with aero testing and products that are sort of pushing the boundaries in that respect. A lot of testing has been done on not just rim width and tire width and profiles of the rims and depth, but on the relationship between the tire width and the rim width as they meet along the side of the wheel and the airflow over that. And I imagine, like we talked about in last week's episode, if you were paying attention or go back and listen to that one, especially at Unbound this year, we noticed a huge jump in tire width being used. And so it follows that the rim widths would, for true aerodynamic gains to be realized, would have to correspond in their width as well, so that interface between tire and rim was smooth and as aero as the marketing department would want you to think that it is. And so but I'm sure that it is more aero, and that was as tires became wider on road bikes. I remember that was a big part of the trend and the push for wider rims, like the Firecrest rim Zip did back then, when those were kind of the new wide rim on the market before anybody else was really doing that on the scale that they were. And so it seems fitting that we're seeing some wide stuff from them, among others. Yeah, for sure. And speaking of aero, there was also a prototype Fox fork, which was questionably either like a home job or something actually done by Fox. And we actually got confirmation from the Canadian Maxxis factory team rider, Andrew Lesby, that it actually was sent to him by Fox. It's like an almost aero fairings put on an existing suspension fork, gravel suspension fork, but it does look like that is probably going to be the next step in gravel suspension, is them making that relatively aero. And related to that, I had heard on Josh Portner's Silka podcast that they had put the Lauf suspension fork in the wind tunnel and actually found it to be pretty good based on the aero shaping on it. So I think there probably are some gains to be had here as far as matching suspension with aero, which I don't know, it feels like something that could be taken back to the mountain bike world.
Do you remember those especially like the early 90s, you would see guys doing speed tests on snow going like 125 miles
The
per
land
hour.
speed record.
Yeah, crazy speeds, wearing like fully faired helmets and outfits. And they add RockShox GDDH, all 80 millimeters of that downhill fork with a little aero profile kind of zip tied off the back of each leg, which I'm sure did something. It certainly looked awesome. And I still think about it to this day, obviously. And so that's what it reminded me of, basically, was when I saw that. But I agree with you that there is, I think in races, especially of the length and sort of sustained speeds of a fairly flat gravel race, like Unbound Aero is definitely going to be the frontier that's probably worth investing in more than anything. It also probably helps to shroud that hydraulic hose underneath something, so maybe that's an easy way of doing it rather than routing it through some kind of cast leg that has a hole from one end to the other. But so, yeah, I think that, I've always thought that it was sort of funny that fewer road bikes even now have any sort of aero provision around the caliper. But I could see there's definitely some room in those respective departments where some aero work is yet to be done. We'll see.
Yeah, that's actually a good point, because back in December we had a podcast. I think the title was "Has the Industry Reached Peak Gravel?" Controversial title. Wasn't my doing, but at the time, and I went back and listened to that episode because it was actually Payson McAlvin, pro gravel race. I think he got 8th place or something at Unbound this year. Had mentioned how wrong we were in hindsight, because his bike setup is very different to gravel bikes from 6 months ago. He was running 2.2 inch mountain bike tires on his gravel bike. He's got this new SRAM drivetrain on there. We saw a number of pros using suspension forks. So I guess some of the things we said, it does seem like gravel still has some room to grow. But I guess the main point made back then in December was that, and James made this point, which was that gravel sits in this window between road and mountain bike, and that there's kind of only so much room for gravel to grow before it like kind of butts up against one or two of the disciplines. But I guess what we're seeing now is that they're in some ways borrowing from both disciplines in more ways than I ever thought we'd see. So we're actually seeing like genuine mountain bike tire widths being used while trying to make them more aero, while trying to, add the appropriate gearing around this to also, have road-like gearing because they're going at road-like speed. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting, but I think that's the next frontier of gravel, is trying to figure out how to balance fitting in mountain bike wide tires within like a road bike crank spacing, and that, I think that is the limit, right? Like I think we've been there for a while, and there's only so much space between the crank and such a wide tire. I think that's going to be the controlling factor.
Where that angle, you suddenly can scrub the knobs on the side of the tire in certain gear if things are too tight. So
for sure,
the engineers will have to sort through that one. But I feel like gravel is sort of emerging as like in the way that mountain biking did, where it just developed so many subgenres. And I think we're already seeing it. Like, so the big brands like Specialized, and Canyon, among others, have kind of a race-oriented category of gravel bike model, and then like kind of more of an adventure-oriented gravel bike model. And I think you can cut it a lot finer than that for kind of, as Ronan was talking about, kind of whether you should have one bike that does everything kind of well, or four options that do one thing very specifically well and the other three kind of poorly. And so as long as there's racing involved, the athletes are going to sort of somewhat demand that the bikes. I have a few things to say on this topic, that the bikes are raceable. We looked at a lot of guys at Unbound riding suspension forks, which I think generally have been somewhat unpopular among racing gravel type, whether pros or amateur alike. They're kind of, I don't know if it's not enough to be relevant, or sort of heavy, or not aero, or what is exactly driving you haven't seen it used much until this year at Unbound, I would say. And from my experience with pro racing and how that interfaces with companies' marketing departments, a lot of the things that are used are not necessarily the number one choice of the rider, but due to obligations or expectations from the sponsor. Sometimes things on the biggest stage, there are some concessions made here and there, and sometimes athletes do in fact have to toe the marketing line somewhat and do things that they may not otherwise have done. And I don't know to whom that applies, if it does in this case, but I could imagine that there may be a little bit of that too, and sort of some of the choices being driven by marketing departments rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting thing I always try to keep in my mind when I'm looking at some of what is happening and where it's happening, so at big mountain bike events or the Tour de France or whatever, all these huge stages oftentimes bring out the best of the marketing department for better or worse. And sometimes you see choices made that perhaps if left to
not
a rider's own. Yes.
Yeah. That's the bike industry, and that's what.
But that's it.
So
I think we wrapped it
the
up.
racing world, right? It's funded by
exactly.
the brands that need to sell products. So
exactly.
Yeah.
But to that end, though, I think there are products that are very relevant too, and that do actually
for sure
enhance the experience. And so I think in that way, we'll see gravel kind of split into 3 or 4 genres at some point over the next few years, where SRAM may offer 3 or 4 different options for gravel that include
for sure
something more adventure oriented than the racing edge and somewhere in between.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I was a gravel suspension skeptic 6 months ago, but and there have been quite a few bad examples that I've ridden, but very recently, I've been on a Santa Cruz Stigmata, which is a review I need to really finish up, but that bike actually has geometry that is really well dialed around the height of a gravel suspension fork, and there is genuine. One, if you're just out riding and you want to ride a gravel bike and something where you would have previously ridden, say, a hardtail mountain bike, then it makes a lot of sense. But 2, anytime the terrain gets slightly rough, I mean, the momentum that bike carries because of the suspension is actually pretty ridiculous. I hadn't expected it to be that obvious, but I went from riding with this one friend that I ride with regularly, and I kind of just went from riding alongside of him, or he's often out in front, to just smoothly dropping him on every descent. And it was pretty blatant as far as the performance increase there. And he was also trying to figure out with swap bikes and all that, and he was also pretty stunned by the outcome. So there's certainly gains still to be had. And yes, Payson, if you're listening, didn't quite nail that one back in December. So with that, I think we might take a quick little break and come back with what's on our mind. Brad, unless you've got something else on your mind, for me, what's been on my mind this week is crank bolts and other tight bolts on bicycles that can be hard to undo. And what prompted this to be on my mind is a video on Instagram by a bike mechanic out of Korea, Bike Royd, and it basically showed him wrapping an inner tube around a hex key and looping it against the pedal until a SRAM dub crank bolt, which have a notorious reputation for getting quite tight to undo. Until the constricting force of this wrapped inner tube basically snapped the bolt free. And I thought that was rather cool, and went ahead and tested it myself, and eventually got it to work. It didn't quite work as quickly as what he showed, but it did eventually work. And I wrote a little story on it in Escape Collective about the experience. But stuck crank bolts is on my mind as a result of that.
So that's an all too common experience of not the inner tube part necessarily, but the stuck bolt on the SRAM cranks. It's been somewhat persistent over several generations of cranks, all the way back to the early kind of the BB30, PF30 days. To me, it's not a matter of the bolt seizing, but of like more of a galling between the two.
Yeah,
like the bolt surface and the inside of the self-extracting cap, or the inside, or against the inside of the crank arm where the bolt head sits.
And galling, just so people know, it's more like a mechanical thing where the bolt often is reaching its elastic state and is kind of, especially with lighter bolts, like it's known to happen with aluminium bolts and titanium bolts that have a bit more stretch to them. And it's kind of like the bolt stretches enough and then like locks itself into place because of that stretch. And that's seemingly what's happening here. And I mean, there's a torque spec, and the torque to remove the torque spec is like triple what the torque to install it was, so that it's not as simple as just being really tight. And I mean, I've never tried the inner tube trick. I did see the same thing, of course. It was sent to me by a number of folks, and my method was always simply I always carry a couple toe straps around from like an old toe clip style pedal from those things are infinitely handy, and I would kind of double loop the crank arm into the chainstay of the bike and put the 8mm in there, and then get I use the handle of my Abbey hammer just because it happens to be hollow and easy to usually be accessible. So that's enough for me, and then you can kind of muscle up on that with a bit of a longer lever, and that's never failed me. But be careful on some frames. I was going to say, so your method's quite a common one. I know Brad Kelly out of Australia, who's another, if you follow Mechanics on Instagram, you probably come across Brad, another Brad, sorry.
BK.
And BK, he does that method as well with attaching the non-drive side crank to the frame. For me, I've done it. It works. I feel comfortable doing it on certain like aluminium frames, but like, if I had a stuck crank on a Specialized Athos, I would probably think twice about trying that. I mean, it might be fine, but there's also a small chance it's not going to be fine.
Yeah, you're right. You don't want to find out that it wasn't fine because there's no coming back from that. Yeah.
So,
but you'd hope it would be fine, though. You'd hope that the amount of force you yourself and your legs with all your weight on it would be more. And it could handle that than this amount of force, but it is applied quite directly to one spot, and so it's
in a
definitely
spot that probably wasn't designed for compression
strapping
force.
down.
So given that, like my method, I mean, this inner tube method is very interesting, and it's probably something I would do if out on the road somewhere, or if traveling at a race and I need to undo a crank that was stuck. I'd seriously consider doing this, but in the workshop it did feel a little slow, and it also felt a little tiring to have to pull an inner tube that tightly. So for me, I still this might horrify people, but I actually quite like the Ugga Dugga machine. So an electric impact or an air impact, I mean, if the forces it creates a hammering effect on the bolt. It's very isolated as far as the forces go. Like you can basically, you almost don't even need to hold on to the crank. It's that isolated. So it's not creating a huge amount of force through the bike like you might expect. It's actually very delicate on the rest of the bike. The argument is it's probably not super delicate on the aluminium bolt. In my experience, it hasn't caused any noticeable wear or digging into the bolt, but there is that small risk, I guess, or argument to be made. My alternative method is to have the bike on the ground and secure the non-drive side crank or the drive side crank with like a long pole over the crank. So you put a rag over the crank, you put a long pole over the crank, and then you get yourself I like to use a breaker bar, which is like a very long length kind of non-ratcheting ratchet, I guess, and get an 8mm socket, and then that gives you extreme leverage to undo the bolt. And often at that point, if you're needing to go to these resorts, then you'll often hear a very loud and worrying snap as the bolt breaks free, followed by a burning smell in the air.
Some burning. Oh, I love the smell of burning. Yeah.
So it actually you actually do create a spark through the heat of undoing these bolts. That's how tight they can be. So so that's crank bolts for you. It's not, I should probably say this isn't specific to SRAM Dub. It's just SRAM Dub is the most common example of it in the market at the moment.
And it's like 100% of them have this experience. It's not like 1 out of 10. It's like 1 out of 1. Yeah. It's all.
Brad, have you had any success in finding a prevention for this?
I will. Yes, I think so. It's not a permanent thing, so you have to do this kind of every time the crank is off. I would actually drip like some very heavy oil, like what you might use in wet conditions for chain lube, is a good option. Both from what would be the inside of the crank, kind of where the bolt is. You see the threads of the bolt and the splined recess that would sit on the spindle, kind of down there, and the crank bolt is sort of captured by the self-extracting cap on the outside, so it doesn't fall out. But you can kind of run some heavier oil in there, and then I'll just turn the bolt and try to get you can kind of feel it when it's got a nice coating of oil on the underside, because it's really where the bolt touches the crank arm underneath the bolt head. That's where the issue occurs. And so by putting it's not quite grease, but you could take the extracting cap off and do it with grease too. But, in my experience, this has been sufficient. Both would work well, but just to get some lube in there to kind of create a sort of barrier between the two contacting surfaces and hopefully prevent some of that galling from occurring. It usually literally lasts like one time, but it is noticeably better to remove it. But you have to keep doing it, because kind of once you turn the bolt, once it sort of squeegees away everything that was there, and you're back to two metal surfaces again. So I don't have any data around this, but it's a feeling. I've started to remove the self-extracting cap, which can be annoying to remove. And that then lets you take the bolt out of the crank arm. And then I've been using anti-seize, which I put behind the bolt head. And my theory with anti-seize is that it just holds better. Like it doesn't get that squeegeed out effect. Like it's more likely to stay there. And it's a bit more of like a kind of more of a permanent solution to the issue. But I mean, we're talking about needing an extra tool to get the self-extracting cap off. Typically, like for me, like I've really struggled to get those caps off with anything less than like the Abbey bike tools. I was going to say they make one for that, and it's that's the only one that's
but
no
like
pin
in theory you can use like a cheap pin spanner, but I've never actually had success in removing these caps with that. You'll probably just scratch your crank. So there are some special tools required to go this detailed. I think Brad's method sounds like a pretty good compromise without having to pull things apart. Mine
was derived from having to pull cranks like 5 times a day, swapping chain rings and doing this. And so mine was that's sort of the ghetto solution, but your way would be the pro way, Dave. And sometimes our paths diverge in that way.
Yeah, thank you. So on that, like not to get too into the weeds, but I've actually and this probably voids the warranty of my Abbey tools, but a little impact wrench on that self-extracting cap, it makes it super quick. Like no slipping, no futzing around, no straining to get that cap off. It just zips straight off, and then you can get into the bolt. And then if that cap comes off really easily, then you probably want to put a dab of Loctite on it, because you don't have to go mountain biking too often to find them on trails. They can fall out. So
it's like so the reason the pin spanner doesn't work is because sometimes the factory Loctite they put on them is so extreme to keep them from rattling out, which they so often do, that you can't. But then sometimes they don't have any, and then they are gone, so then you can't take the crank off anyway. And it's a joy. Yeah. All
right. Well, I'll stop shitting on this for too much longer, but I will say the other prevention thing, if you are wanting to remove your crank semi-regularly, the other known solution, and this is sort of further proves that it's galling and not a seizing issue or not a corrosion issue, is you can actually swap the stock aluminium bolt that comes on the higher end cranks. You can swap it for a SRAM steel bolt, and the steel bolt doesn't seem to exhibit the same issues. And that's proof that this is galling, because the steel bolt doesn't stretch as much. So, I mean, I rest my case.
SRAM gave us that as a solution too, because we would anti-seize everything, so there was definitely not a seizure issue. Put the cranks on in the morning, and by afternoon when they had to come off again, couldn't get the crank off without going to some of these extreme measures we've described. And that was their suggestion. But then you're adding some, it's a rather large bolt, so it might be 15 grams heavier than the aluminum one, or I don't know. I didn't really weigh them, but we didn't really like that as the solution either necessarily. I mean, it's not the weight you're going to really win the race on or not. But nevertheless, these guys don't want to add weight when they could just make the mechanic's life harder, but not have a heavier bike. That's usually the choice that they would make.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
For speaking from the athlete's perspective, yes.
Yeah. Oh, well, there you go. Cranks, expect me to come back to this topic and probably repeat a lot of what we've just said in a future edition of Threaded. So, I'll cover this in writing at some point. But for now, if you want to see what we mean by this inner tube method, you can just head to escapecollective.com, and in the tech section, you'll find an article just about that. So, Brad, I think I might keep our pick one for next week because we're already running a little long, and there's still some more news to cover, which I think some of this stuff is purely worth covering because it made me giggle. Other things are worth covering because they're genuine improvements. Let's head back into some tech news. Top of my list of things that are making me giggle. I'm giving out an award for the best ribbon cutting ceremony, and it goes to Bianchi because they've opened up their newly renovated facility in Cerviglio. I just butchered that name, but I'm sticking to it. And they're now capable of producing 500 bikes a day. But it does seem like when they say producing it, I'm not seeing any footage or any photos of them actually manufacturing frames as they have previously suggested they will get online. Rather, what I am seeing at the moment is a basically assembly. So what I'm seeing is frames coming in, and they basically now have full in-house facilities to do complete bike assembly, and 500 bikes a day at the moment. But yeah, previous press releases from the company had specified that they had goals of producing carbon frames in-house and up to 1,000 bikes a day production capacity. But that was kind of peak COVID that they were claiming that. So yeah, I think that's one I'd like to follow up on and hear whether they still have plans to bring that carbon manufacturing in-house. But for now, it's a pretty cool facility that I saw, and that it was all electric movement as far as moving the bikes between assembly stages, and no tools on the ground. Everything was elevated, which is really cool. So like if you drop something, everyone working there knows you've dropped something.
The ultimate shame.
Yeah.
It's a state-of-the-art facility. It's quite beautiful. It is the color you'd expect it to be. The whole building is celeste from the outside. It's wonderful.
Yeah. And that ribbon cutting ceremony, the award, there's a photo of the CEO cutting a ribbon, which is literally just a piece of string. And in the photo, they haven't cropped it tight enough, so you can actually see the two people holding this 1 meter length of string just like up on the stage.
My question, James, was it a tape measure with like a retractable end?
Was it? No, I think it was just a piece of string from what I saw.
I thought it was he was holding like a tape measure with a retractable tape, and it was. I think the guy on the right side, as you're looking, his stage left, I guess you'd say, appears to be holding like a white object in his hand. You have the picture.
Oh, it gets better. Okay.
I think so. And to me, it's if that's the case, I mean, it's a waste of tape measure. I mean, come on.
This ceremony like really measures up then. It's
yeah, exactly. I wonder, hopefully it was just like a random one with inches that they didn't need. Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah. So congrats on Bianchi moving into the newly renovated facility, and keen to see what happens next, because it did sound like this is sort of phases of improvement. And the other thing I like that I saw was a lot of solar panels in that factory. So good for summer. Fulcrum have some wheels cheekily named. I'm going to say cheekily named the Sharq with a Q. And it seems like all bets are off as far as the wavy pattern rims that Zip tried to defend the patents on and lost in court to Princeton Carbon Works. I mean, Zip had originally come out saying that they'll biomimicry of the pectoral fins of a humpback whale. So now Fulcrum saying it's like the shape of a shark.
Okay.
Yeah.
The profiling of the rim is actually pretty cool on these. It kind of like, it's more like 3-dimensional in sort of how the, what do you even call that effect? Like the ridges, they kind of wrap around and down the sides of the rim more, I would say, than the zip
undulating effect.
Yes. Mm-hmm. The gill slit, as it were, of the rim extends down. So it's like not just bumpy along the inner diameter of the rim, but also along the sides a little bit. I think that looked to me like it was a little bit of a difference.
More bite.
Exactly.
Some facts on this: 42 to 47 millimeter undulating rim depth, 25 millimeter internal width with mini hooks, so you can run tubes or tubeless on these. It's an undrilled rim, like many of Fulcrum's rims, so you don't need rim tape to get that tubeless seal. And 1,440 grams claimed for the wheel set. And it's worth noting that this is Fulcrum's first performance-focused all-road / endurance option. So this isn't meant to be like their professional road racing wheel. It's also not meant to be like a full-blown gravel wheel. It's sort of like a comfortable rim that you'd probably run something like a 32 mil wide road tire on, maybe something even wider than that. That 25 mil internal width is still, from Fulcrum's point of view, more an endurance style wheel, not a race product. It's expect to pay $2,800 for a pair, which Brad, I don't know about you, but this is going to sound harsh, but I'm a little bit bored of $3,000 carbon wheel releases.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting that Fulcrum is sort of the less obvious extension of Campagnolo's.
They are, yeah.
It's owned, or it is ostensibly the same company with a different brand on it, so that people who don't run Campy elsewhere don't feel like they're power clashing or having some brand clash going on that is not cool. So they have an option that is, I would say, uses quite a bit of the technology from Campy's side of life. Rebranded as Fulcrum. They do use some very high quality ceramic bearings in these wheels. I think Campy's ceramic bearings have, perennially been some of the best ones out there since I was a kid, which was a long time ago, for those wondering. But I actually think these rims are, I agree with you that the price tag in the sea of what's available out there, to stick with our ocean going puns, it's not so competitive, because there's some pretty cool wheel options, some of which we talked about last week, that are considerably less than these costs.
Those new Eastern ones, the
Eastern ones were very, very affordable. The DT Swiss ones were still cheaper than these, even with the 180 hub, or the 1100. Let's call it.
At least very close.
It's which are a ceramic bearing as well. So it's a pricey one. Pricey one. Yeah, certainly high quality. Not dissing the quality that Campagnolo and Fulcrum put out.
It just does feel like every week we're talking about another $3,000 wheel set, and I don't know. They're interesting. There's new things coming. I think the tech's great. I'm sure they ride well, but I'd love to see more of, like, in that Eastern price bracket, that sort of sub $2,000 price point. I'd love to see more emphasis put there these days. But hey, can't complain about nice things that I can't afford. So, also new, the offshoot of Shimano Pro Bike Gear, they have a new gravel handlebar, the Discover Aero Carbon. And the reason why I'm bringing up this handlebar is it's actually got some pretty cool features that seem to be incredibly closely aligned to the new handlebar we saw from Zip, that SL80 race bar. And by that I mean there's internal cable routing paths underneath the bar, so it doesn't go through the bar, but it's a channel beneath the bar that then takes the brake hoses into the stem, if you wish. Very similar to something that, say, Cervelo has done on a lot of their bikes in recent years. And then on top of that, there's also, just behind where the hoods sit, the handlebars kind of extended, so your hand has more of a perch that follows the contours of and the width of the hood. It's sort of like around that 90-degree nook of the handlebar, there's a extended section that kind of covers and shrouds, say, like the brake hose nut, and just gives you what I would call it more comfort.
A thumb rest.
A thumb rest. I like that.
It's just because not everyone knows where the brake nut is located. You know,
sure.
You know where your thumb goes. And it's for that. It's a thumb rest. It's thoughtful.
Yeah, it's thoughtful, and it's interesting because SRAM's just done it, and now Shimano's just done it. So, and clearly it's come out soon enough that you can't say one copied the other because these things take time to develop. So they're both playing at the same concept, and I don't think this is the last we'll see of it from either brand. I think this is going to become a more common thing in drop bar handlebars in general. It's like this more integrated approach.
Yeah, it makes the transition from the curve from the top into the transition into the hood appear to be very seamless. Which for me, that's always been an aesthetic kind of bugaboo on some bars.
For sure.
Traditional round bars, especially with some of the hydraulic levers these days have gotten so big and wide, especially because of the hydraulic fittings. And so I think it looks cool. Personally, I hadn't seen it until just today, actually. So
cool. And it's worth noting that it's like this is only able to happen. I really think it's hydraulic disc brakes have allowed it to happen, but also electronic shifting. In the past, handlebars have had to cater to assuming people would be running either mechanical gearing on 3 different brands of shifters, and they kind of had to pick like a happy medium that would work with all different cable routing options and lever shape options. Whereas now what we're seeing is like this more integrated approach where, this pro handlebar is obviously going to be better shaped to a new Shimano lever, and SRAM's new zip bar was, specifically radius to its new shifter. So I think it's cool to see some numbers on this new handlebar. What I like, it's got a 72 millimeter reach, which is quite a bit shorter than the 80 mil reach on that zip bar. It's a 12-degree flare, which is a little bit more flare than I personally like, but people get on with that. You're looking at 265 grams in the narrowest width. The biggest downside I'm seeing is there is no narrower option than a 40 centimeter in this handlebar. So I think they've skewed the widths a little bit too wide, but hey, that's just me. And then on top of that, there's a new gravel standard protocol from Pro. So they're now testing their handlebars. Their gravel handlebars are now being tested, from what I can see, more closer to their mountain bike protocol as far as loads applied repeatedly. Whereas before, I guess any drop handlebar was considered a road handlebar, which sort of had lower testing figures. So, it's cool to see. I've also heard similar from Ritchie, so nice progress there.
Yeah, that stands up to the logic test. I would say that's a good a good standard to maybe enhance slightly for this. We actually had a debate about that today at the bike shop about hoods slipping on gravel bike bars when people kind of get a little bit too rowdy on some mountain bike trails and take a frontal impact holding the hoods in their hands, and then kind of, the torque value is relatively low on a carbon bar, especially, which it was. And so you kind of like, should I tighten it more or just try to not do that, because it's like maybe you don't want to over tighten, let's say, some carbon bars at the clamp there, and then have something unfortunate happen due to stress when you're hitting things at a rate of speed and impact that's a little harder than your average road bike, where you can actually exploit those vulnerabilities. So, cool.
Yeah, that's been my experience with gravel bikes. Is you add a tire insert, which gives you confidence to not pinch flat your front tire, and then you end up like slipping the handlebars through the stem, and you're like,
exactly,
still getting too rad.
So. Makes a case for the one piece, maybe too.
It sure does, actually. Yeah. Anyway, that's a different conversation, which I'm sure we'll have in the near future. But also new, SRAM have now revealed a pod rocker upgrade for their Axis pod shifter. So this is the pod shifter that came out with mountain bike transmission, and it's sort of that shifter that sort of hangs down like a little robotic face off your handlebar. And they've got a new button upgrade that you can swap the 2 individual buttons for basically a paddle that rocks up and down. And it's just $22 to make this upgrade to your existing shifter, or you can buy a whole shifter for $150 US, and they've got them in left and right variants. Brad, have you had your hands on one of these yet?
Not the new thing. No, I haven't. But it's cool. I found the new pod style shifter to not be exactly to my liking though. So I kind of like this idea. This is almost like what the old Axis shifter was like in a lot of, especially early days when the transmission stuff started to come out, maybe or before it really came out. A lot of the athletes liked the group, but didn't like the shifter and used the old shifter, which you can totally do. And many of them may still be doing that. And you might even take a close look at some bikes being raced right now and at the World Cup and see some people who may still opt for that old one. This might be kind of the way SRAM works around that and provides a similar product that is new but works like the old one does.
It was a complaint when I first reviewed XXSL transmission over a year ago, and I didn't think they completely nailed the ergonomics on the shifter, and I kind of remarked that my preference was to go back to the old shifter, and for me, this looks like a good improvement. I still think they've got some room to move, pun intended, in regards to the placement of the shifter. So their matchmaker, I think I'd like to see another clamp come from them, which has a bit more of a straight edge to it rather than the kind of swoopy shape that it is now. I think there's, for me, I'm still chasing a position of the shifter that is kind of outside of the allowable range of just what the current one does. But I mean, it's cool to see them make these improvements, and at $22 to upgrade an existing shifter, I mean, that's pretty cool. So anyway, nice to have options. Brad, I think we've covered enough there. There were a few other little bits and pieces, a few new bikes on the list, but I don't know if we need to get to them today. We might come back to them in a future topic if you're happy to wrap it.
They'll be here next time.
They'll still be here. I mean, one of the bikes,
be new, kind of.
Truthfully, one of the bikes I just wanted to poke fun at, which is just being mean, which is Ducati have expanded their range of e-bikes. So you can now get an electric gravel bike from Ducati, which comes with bags. But I mean, the thing I was going to point out is that these really just seem to exist in Ducati or similar motorbike stores, and I can't imagine that they've been hugely successful as far as moving off the floors for these dealers. But
the McLaren option was pretty cringy. That little commercial they produced, that was rough. But I imagine it's the person who's in the showroom might check that option and just add an extra couple grand once you paid for the new McLaren, a couple $1,000 for a new e-bike seems perfectly reasonable.
Yeah. So I mean, this bike seems perfectly generic. Seems carbon frame, FSA motor driven. But I think it's interesting to still see the investment from motorsport and from motorbike and automotive worlds. But so far, I mean, we're not seeing anything that's truly revolutionary come from them. A lot of them are taking a more generic path, a lower investment path. But expect to see a lot of these brands appear at Eurobike this year, which is an interesting change. So I know Ducati will be there, which is not it's not free to attend Eurobikes. I mean, they are invested in selling bicycles. So anyway, on that, I figured, should we say farewell for another week, and I'll catch up with you again this time next week.
Sounds good, Dave.
All right.
I'll miss you till then.
Thanks, Brad. All right. Well, that's been this week's episode of Geek Warning. If you like what you heard, please share it with friends. Tell someone in your riding group with a noisy bike that they can perhaps learn how to make the bike quieter by listening to this podcast. And if you do support what Escape Collective does, thank you very much. Your membership makes this content and even better content possible. And if you're not already a member, please consider supporting us. Your membership does make an impact. It does help us create content. It does help our little organic independent business thrive. So thank you. Until then, cheers.
Bye.